Welcome to Something to Talk About. Today we're stepping into a conversation that sounds simple, but lives in very complicated spaces. It's called boundaries. We hear it all the time. Set better boundaries, protect your time, guard your energy, speak up for yourself. But what happens when setting a boundary feels like building a wall? When protecting your space looks like pushing people away? When saying no threatens a connection, threatens intimacy, or even identity? For many of us, especially in long-term relationships like families, friendships, and the workplace, boundaries can feel risky. We don't want a conflict. We don't want to disappoint. We don't want to be misunderstood. So today we're asking a deeper question. How do you create boundaries without creating barriers? How do we stay open and yet be protected? Connected, but clear. Loving without losing ourselves. This isn't about ultimatums or emotional shutdown. It's about maturity, communication, timing, tone, temperature, and the courage to honor both ourselves and the relationship. If you've ever struggled to say what you need without damaging what you value, this conversation's for you. So let's talk. Today's guest understands boundaries not as theory, but as practice. John Wooten has spent years building partnerships and strengthening community organizations across Northern Virginia, work that definitely requires both compassion and clarity. Most recently, he served as director of the Clearbrook Center of the Arts, where he worked alongside small business owners and creators, helping them to set goals, manage expectations, and grow within a shared space. If you've ever worked in a shared space, whether that's in an office, a marriage, or a community, you know boundaries matter. Before that, John was with the Northern Virginia Food Rescue, where he cultivated relationships with more than 100 donors and nonprofit partners and helped launch a food distribution program that reached libraries throughout Prince William County. That kind of work demands empathy. It demands trust. And it definitely demands knowing when to say yes and when to say no in a way that keeps those relationships intact. With a background in business administration and data science, John brings both heart and structure to the table, which makes him a powerful voice for today's conversation on setting boundaries without building barriers. John, welcome to Something to Talk About.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let me start by asking you a question.
Okay.
When you hear the word boundaries, what does it mean to you at this stage of your life? And do you think your generation approaches it differently than those generations before you?
So I look at boundaries as kind of a set of guidelines that you set for yourself and how you're going to show up in a particular relationship, whether that's friends, family, or work. And I view that as something different from rules, which I feel like people mix up with the word boundaries, and rules are focused on controlling other people's behavior. So as far as the how millennials look at boundaries, I think there has been a little bit of a shift that has stirred up a little bit of controversy. I don't know if you've heard about more millennials going no contact with some family members, for example, or um, just the kind of pushback about the boundaries that millennials are setting at work. So I definitely think there's a little bit of a shift.
Why don't we take a practical example and try to walk through that? Because it's one thing to define boundaries philosophically, and it's another one to live them, right? And,
Right.
when you were talking about millennials, what that brought to mind for me was, I think you're aware of this. My father's family is all in what used to be a small town in Virginia. The whole family, distant relatives, all kind of live within a 2 or 3 block radius. I mean, every other house was a family member. Because of that, there was this tradition of people just knocking on the door and walking in because, after all, it's my brother or it's my first cousin or it's my aunt. Why do I need to be so formal? And I know that during my father's era, no one would have dared to say to a relative, I don't really want you to do that. I would prefer that you give me a call before you come over. Do you define that as a boundary?
Yes. So. I think what you described about people going to the your neighbor's house and kind of that open community, that's a great thing when that's a choice, when you actively choose to do that. But when it's getting to a point where you're reflexively doing these things and not thinking about your own capacity, that's a sign that a boundary's being eroded. So I look at boundaries as an act of self-care.
So, how do you set that kind of a boundary without offending someone, pushing someone away? Because what you don't want to do is negatively impact the relationship. Still want the relationship with that relative. You just don't want them kind of walking into your space all the time unannounced.
So I think the best way to approach that is when there's an open conversation between both people. So there's no guarantee that they won't be offended. Because again, some people view rules as boundaries. So when you put that up, they think, oh, you're this person is building a barrier in our relationship. When instead you're trying to talk about your needs and then see where you guys can meet in the middle.
So okay, let me understand here. Is a boundary a situation that needs to be negotiated? Or can you just have very strong feelings about someone violating your space? I'm confused, and I think a lot of people are confused about what does a boundary really look like?
So a boundary, it's not the boundary that needs to be negotiated, but it's once you bring up your needs, hopefully with the conversation with them, they could bring up their needs. And that's where the discussion happens to see how you can uh continue to have a healthy relationship. So for example, this is going to be a work example because this is, I think, really relatable. Make a boundary would look like professionally, I'm not going to answer calls after 6 o'clock. It's really straightforward. That's, you're talking about how you're able to, your commitment that you're going to give to the other things in your life outside of work. And you're not going to let work kind of erode in your personal space in an unhealthy way. Does that make sense? Or
It does. It does. As you were talking, I thought about a situation that I encountered when I was in school. I don't know if you've ever lived in a dorm, but you don't, it's not a lot of personal space there, right? And
right.
so we had a refrigerator in our room. It was just two people in the room. And you could stock it with what you liked: sodas, juice, water, whatever. And there was room in there for everybody to have space in there. And I remember finding that I was putting I was always the one buying stuff and putting it in. My roommate was always the one helping herself to the sodas or the juice or whatever was in the refrigerator. I felt the need to establish a boundary. Now, I don't think that's a rule, but I think it is a boundary
Right.
that says,
Right.
listen, you know, if you're going to drink something that I purchased, you need to ask me about that first. It's not saying you can't
Yes.
have it, but you've got to ask me so
Right.
that I'm not coming home expecting to find X in the refrigerator and they're all gone.
Right.
So because I find that for me, I have a tendency to lay back for a while and just watch a situation to determine whether or not this is habitual or this is just a one off, right? Just happens to be that day you came in
Right.
and you were parched and you didn't have any more water left, and I had a couple of bottles of water and you just took one. That's very different than all the time you're always doing the same thing. So
Right.
I wonder if you could kind of give some suggestions about how to have that conversation. Because I know that that's not something that's, a knockdown, drag out fight, hopefully. But people will sometimes feel like they can't say anything about that. And so then it creates a level of tension that eventually turns into a bigger problem.
Yes. And what I think that narratives can be a dangerous way to cause you to erode your own boundaries. So, for the example that you had with your roommate, if you expressed that boundary and your roommate said, "Come on, I'm your roommate. Come on, like you're really gonna be like that," then that well, that's a sign, first of all, that that relationship's unhealthy. And I think I yeah, I think it's important to double down on your boundaries in those instances.
Another thing that I thought about, and I wonder how you feel about that. Um, we have a relationship, you and I, and I
Mhm.
say to you, you can call me anytime. I don't care, day or night. If you need to talk to me, I will make myself available. And so I have shared with you when it comes to you making a phone call. I don't have any boundaries with you, right? And I know that there have been scenarios that I've heard about where one party does have an open border kind of situation. You can call anytime. And I think that 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 same person assumed, since their friend took advantage of that freedom, that meant they could reciprocate, but it didn't mean that. And for the person that did not want to be called whenever, they struggled with how to, if I'm availing myself of your friendship whenever I need it, it's difficult for me to say to you, but you can't call me after 11 o'clock at night.
I understand, but I also think it's important that we recognize that everybody has different capacity, and boundaries respect that. Uh, for instance, if I'm uh introvert and I have a friend that's an extrovert and they always want to go out, and I have low capacity to do that, well, a boundary might be, hey, I can only do that once a week. And I feel like somebody, if someone's your friend or someone cares about you, they'll understand that you have different capacities. Again, that's not advocating to uh ignore the person or neglect a relationship, but the negotiation comes around, I think, where your two capacities meet, where it's a mutual choice to show up and you're not acting reflexively out of trying to play a role. Like, oh, I have to be, the good friend, or I have to be the good, just fill in the blank. And that happens sometimes, but I guess what I'm talking about is more when uh things are one-sided, when it's always one person that's neglecting their needs and the other person that has more liberty. That's unhealthy.
While it may be unhealthy, is it unfair if you have considerable capacity to expect that if you've given me kind of an open door policy, that I shouldn't reciprocate? And if
Mm,
I don't intend to do that, how do I convey to you that that boundary doesn't work for me?
I think just plainly, I think you should just say, hey, like, I appreciate that you're open to me calling at any time, but I I go to bed at uh 11 o'clock, so I can't answer any calls past 9. I think that's a reasonable ask.
I think so too, but I think that oftentimes, John, people get nervous with that. If I've allowed you to do whatever, then I feel obligated, right, to reciprocate.
But I think that gets into the role playing I was just referring to, where it's kind of, I think in a way that's, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. In a way, it's a performance. And when I say performance, I don't mean that you don't genuinely want to reciprocate, but I think when you're focused on the, for example, in that context, trying to be the good friend, and that's
Hmm.
separated from looking at both of your capacities, that's where it becomes problematic.
Okay, I'm gonna share with you a real life situation that I experienced a number of years ago. My background is HR. And so we are often privy to information that the rank and file employee doesn't have available to them. And the company I was working for was a big computer company, and we were getting ready to go through layoffs. The company was rebranding itself as a services company as opposed to a products company, right? So we were going to be doing layoffs, and they were going to be massive. It wasn't going to be like two people here and two people there. It was going to be a sizable number of employees that were going to be let go corporate wide, not just at our location. Because of that, there are these practices that we had to go through. We had to do, you know, equal employment testing to make sure we weren't laying off a disparate number of women or minorities or whatever, disabled or older people. So we did all that testing. So we had the information of who was on the list to be laid off. And on one of the lists was a person, I'm going to call her a friendly and not a friend. This is not somebody that I had a close personal relationship with, but she was somebody that I did lunch with occasionally. We might go to happy hour every now and then. She and I shared a friend, so a lot of times we would both be in the same setting together. We were friendly. Her name was on the list. And we had already gone through a series of layoffs throughout the organization over the last month. And then it came to her department, which I think was maybe finance. And I saw that her name was on the list, and I asked some probing questions about why her name had been added. but it was just a numbers matter. It wasn't, she's a bad person. It's just, we've got to let some people go here. And we're looking at skills and experience. And she just was on the bottom end of some of those ranges. And so the day that they were doing the layoff, she was not at work that day. I don't recall if she called in sick. I don't know really what the circumstances were. But the layoff was done, and she heard that people had called for her, and she wasn't there. So she calls me and she says to me, "Am I on the list?" That's not something I can share. I couldn't share it if it was my brother. I just couldn't go there. And so I said to her, "You know that I can't have that conversation with you." She was like, "Why? You're my friend. You should tell me if you know something's going to negatively impact me at that level of magnitude. I would expect that you would say something." And I said to her, "You know what kind of job I'm in. You know the restrictions around confidentiality. I'm surprised that you're even asking me that." Now,
Right.
it wasn't something that we had talked about before because it had never come up before. But here we are now, and there are some expectations that require a boundary to be set. And I know that when I tell her I can't say anything, that is going to potentially impact our relationship. Any advice for how you deal with situations like that? I mean, I know how I handled it, but other people may find themselves in something similar.
Well, I mean, I think for the example that you just gave, uh, that person was already putting you in a bind by asking for that when they know the consequences of you um giving them that information. So that's that's not a friend. And it sounded like they were using that, they're imposing on you that, oh, we're friends even though you're not, to as a way to try to erode your boundaries. So yeah, for me, I think for me in that situation, it would have been easier for me to set that boundary. That might have been harder if that was a family member or somebody who was actually a friend. Um, so I guess how I would handle it, I'd like to think that I would just pull them aside and have the conversation that, I can't disclose that information. And uh yeah, I don't really know what else you can do at that point, because that sounds pretty cut and dry as far as, if you do if you disclose that information, you're probably going to face consequences with work. So, and that's your livelihood.
Absolutely. But one of the other things that happened is that the mutual friend that we both shared was a friend. And she felt bad for her friend, and she was like, "Why couldn't you have said something? Just gave her a heads up, maybe not tell her exactly, but kind of hint around." And I felt like, no, I can't go there. And now I realized, because again, that situation hadn't ever presented itself before. So subsequently, I would say to people that I socialized with, that I worked with, you know what kind of job I have. Please don't expect that I'm going to ever be able to share with you information that's confidential. I just can't do it.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that me setting that boundary isn't going to create a, 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 a barrier with us in our relationship. And sometimes it's unavoidable. You have to set the boundary if you have to set the boundary. And sometimes it's not a matter of you losing your job, but it's something similar where I just can't give you that information. And I have to hope that you'll understand.
Yeah, well, and for something like that too, where someone's asking me to do something that has negative consequences to me, I'd question that relationship. Is that a friend? Or if that was a family member, like I'd question. I don't know, that would set off a lot of red flags for me.
Well, if it
I
wasn't,
think
if it,
oftentimes where oh, sorry, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say, if it wasn't a matter of you losing your job, maybe it's something that's that's not that significant, but something that by your professional standards you think are would be problematic for you. I'll give you another example. Now, I'm making this one up. I know that you oversee shared space,
Hmm.
and um, I have an event that I would like to have at a time when someone else normally has the space reserved.
Hmm.
And I come to you and say, John, I know I shouldn't be asking for this, but this is an emergency. I really need to do this. Um, can you bump them out of the space and let me in? Did you know I'm your friend, right? We're friends. We're friends.
Right.
Can you? I can't schedule it on another day. It just won't work for anybody else's schedule. I've got to do that day, and I know that day is Charles's day. Can you
Hmm.
help me out?
So so in that particular situation, what I would personally do is I'd reach out to the person that normally reserves that day and see if they can reschedule. If they'd be open to reschedule. I'd tell them about the situation, kind of give them cliff notes. If they said no, then what I would do is try to find an alternative space for
Hmm.
you to have the event. But I also think like, and this is what I mean when I'm talking about a two-way street when it comes to these things. I would show up that way as a friend. Those are my boundaries that I'm exercising, like things I'd be willing to do to help. But I also think on the receiving end, the friend should realize, hey, you know what? I'm not going to take this personally. I realize that this was a last minute request and John's doing the best they can to meet that need. But if it's one sided and it's just, oh well, how could he, like, I'm his friend and he should have dropped everything so I could have my event there, then yeah, I'd question the friendship at that point.
And especially if I didn't just do it once, but I started making a practice out of it, coming to you at the
Right.
last minute because I'm not scheduling things like I should, or I haven't kind of raised an issue that, yeah, Wednesday's my time, but I'm finding that my community or the people that I normally would invite to these events can't ever do it on Wednesday. That doesn't work for me. I need to switch days, but I don't say anything to you. And what I do is just every week or every other week I'm coming to you saying, oh, I know I said I wasn't going to do this, but I need to ask a favor again. And it's the same
Right.
favor. So at some point you're probably likely to say to me, look, we can't keep having these emergencies, right? That's a
Right.
boundary. Now, I don't know if that's a
Right.
boundary or that's a rule.
No, that's a boundary. That's protecting what I'm able to do. And really, so in that example that you gave, two people's boundaries are being tested. My boundaries, and then if I don't protect my boundaries and I go into the other person that reserved the space, their boundaries are also being tested. So that in that situation, it's imperative to have boundaries.
Okay, so let's switch your role for a second. You're not performing in the character of John. You are now the person that John is coming to all the time to ask for a switch with me so that I can have my event on your day. So you need to say something to John about what?
Yes. That, hey, I can't do this. I like the phrase "no" is a complete sentence. I think somebody that respects your boundaries will understand that. But it's when people are trying to get reasoning out of you, when people try to, again, it gets into the narratives. When people try to set a narrative to get you to erode your boundaries, that's a huge red flag.
Yeah, see, I think that example. It's easier to be John than it is the person who normally has the space that day because okay, John, I can do it today. And then 2 weeks later, you
Right.
come to me again, and I don't know that this is going to be a pattern until probably after the third or fourth time, right? And then I say, come on, John, what's going on? You're always coming to me for Charles to get this space, and why can't you get them to do a better job of scheduling so that they're only having events on their day to have a space?
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't know all the work that Charles had to do to set up for the event.
Right.
Uh, a lot of times, people that work out of my space, they've spent months planning their events. So all of that months of planning can get eroded if I don't set the boundaries up front, even for friends, even for family. And like I said, I have trust that people that are in my life can respect those boundaries and don't need to do the extra needling.
Okay. I think that boundaries in a work setting are not easy, but certainly easier than establishing boundaries with people you have a personal relationship with.
Yeah.
And any examples of challenges or even scenarios you can think of that you can create where it's difficult to set a boundary with a friend or a romantic interest or family member?
I mean, I think family is the most relatable one because everybody goes through the experience of having the relationship, at least coming from a parent child perspective, where when you're a kid, yeah, your parents are going to impose rules on you. It's what's needed, so there's structure. But as an adult, the relationship should change from one party setting rules and the other party adhering to them to a scenario where both people express boundaries that respect their autonomy and a relationship forms from that. And I think that's very hard for a lot of people to make that shift. And
You know, go ahead.
I think that's where the scenario of putting up boundary can come off looking like disrespect when the framework for what the other person's seeing as a boundary is really, oh, I don't have that same um I'm trying to say this in a way without it coming off bad, but I can't think of a better word than I don't have the same level of control that I had over my kid because they're an adult and I have to respect that. It's not the boundary isn't disrespect, it's an expression of needs.
No, I hear you. I was also thinking about a friendship situation where I have a girlfriend. We don't hang out a lot. I'm swamped these days, but when we used to hang out, uh, we decided that we were going to go see a play at Arena Stage, or we were going to go listen to a concert, or or go listen to some jazz, whatever. And she might call me and say, do you want to go to Blues Alley and listen to whoever? And if I said yes, I would find that once we got to Blues Alley, she would tell me she didn't have any money.
Mm.
Well, we're already here now, so okay, I got you. But it got to be a scenario where she never had any. And sometimes I would be the one calling her, but if you can't afford to go, you can always say no. Or you can say, I'd love to go, I can't afford it right now. So that there isn't this
Right.
expectation where you get to the location and now, guess what? Surprise! It's all going to be on you.
Right. Right.
And so, but I struggled with how to set a boundary around that. I mean, I knew what I wanted to say, but I was much younger and I didn't want to hurt my friend's feelings. And I was making a lot more money than she was. And so I just told myself, don't be selfish, help her. But it got to the point where after a while, when I would get an invitation from her, I would say, I can't go. And not because I couldn't go, and not because I wouldn't have enjoyed going, but because I always felt like there would be a sneak attack that I couldn't anticipate and that I was being used. That was a red flag for
Yeah.
me. So one of the things that I'm hearing you say is that when you start seeing red flags, you know that a boundary is needed.
Well, what I look at, so when I start seeing red flags when boundaries are crossed, and so for me the next step is having that conversation. And if they continue to if they continue to break my boundaries, or try to break my boundaries, then that's when I need to decide how I'm going to show up in that relationship. Whether that is, breaking off contact with them, or if it's someone closer, like a relative, it's just changing how I'm able to show up. I think
Do you
that's
consider
it's tougher when it's a relative, but I still think that you shouldn't be in a situation where you're always on the defense, anticipating how your boundaries are going to be broken while they get to do that freely. That's not healthy.
okay, if it's not family members, if it's a friend, is it a boundary if you haven't communicated it?
Uh, yes, but it's still, but that's not to say that you shouldn't communicate it. And I say that because I think there's sometimes, especially for people that grew up as people pleasers, that were told things like "don't be selfish" constantly. I think people uh, are figuring out their boundaries consistently, so they might not know what their boundaries are until they have a reality check with themselves and go, "Wait a second, I why does this bother me when you know such and such it keeps asking me for money? Maybe I need to, maybe that's a boundary of mine that I need to express." And then it's your responsibility to express that to them.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute because you're right. There are times when I think it's probably fair to say you don't know that a certain thing is a boundary until you're constantly irritated by it, right?
Yes.
And so it's been going on for a while. And usually in those instances, when you do convey that it's a boundary and you want to reestablish the guidelines here, you're already somewhat irritable. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair.
Um, and so how does the how how would that impact your communication of the boundary? I guess you got to be careful because you don't want to come across
Yes,
angry because they don't know that that's a problem for you yet.
I think, yeah, I think being self-aware about um just maybe timing of it, but I also think that it's fair if you are a little irritable. I think a loved one should be able to still hear it. Again, that's not justifying like going out and yelling at them, but I think someone that cares about you should be willing to hear when they're doing something that's bothering you, and uh then having that follow-up conversation to see, how to work things out.
Okay, that's a when you say loved one, are you assuming should I assume that you're talking about a family member or are you talking about any kind of friendship relationship at all?
Any type of yeah, I guess I guess I was talking about like friends and like relationships outside of work, like friends, family, those types of relationships.
Well,
Uh
with families, they
Work,
probably know you well enough to know what would be a boundary and what wouldn't be.
exactly.
But a relatively new friend may not know.
That's true. Yes. So yeah, in that situation, I think communicating that as early as possible um is beneficial. And if they act funny about it and they continue to do that, then yeah, I think maybe it's time to reevaluate that friendship if it's a new friendship.
Okay. In the off chance that you establish a boundary and it appears to have created a barrier, any advice about how to go about fixing that scenario?
I think it's not on one person to fix that scenario. But the best that you can do is acknowledging that you feel like there's a barrier. But then it's on the other person to also be open to addressing that.
Okay, anything else that you would like to share with our listeners about boundaries?
It's, it takes practice. I'm still practicing setting boundaries at times because a lot of times things will come up unexpectedly and will happen quickly. And I know for myself, I tend to ruminate and I'm in my head a lot. So, there are instances where I felt my boundary being crossed, but I didn't completely process it till like days after the incident happened. So I think setting time to just practice more self awareness and then exercising and communicating the boundaries to the people around you. Um, yeah, I think it gets easier over time.
And I think we've agreed that it's probably much easier to do it in workplace settings, kind of non-personal situations than the personal ones. And listen, if the conversation goes off the rail, you always have the opportunity, I think, to address that and try to fix the barrier if one has been created.
Absolutely. Well, and I think as far as work, uh, I think that depends on, again, I keep going back to the narrative, but I think it's so important when it comes to boundaries. I think the narrative that you have with your work will affect how you're able to express your boundaries. If And I see this a lot with interns who I think are more likely to erode their boundaries because they're trying to get the job, or they're trying to um, show that they're uh, a star within the company. So I think for someone that's in that situation, it might be hard to express a boundary because you don't want to look like you're not committed. But I still think it's healthy to do that because at the end of the day, nothing's guaranteed. And regardless of what happens, you have to take care of yourself.
I agree with you. So, as we close today's conversation, I hope that the listeners are walking away, excuse me, with this reminder that boundaries are not about distance, they're about design. And they give us the ability to teach people how to love, befriend, partner with us in a way that's going to be the most comfortable and productive for us. They're how we present without really having to ever get to the point of being resentful. And when done thoughtfully, they don't divide, they define, right?
Right.
So, John, I want to thank you for reminding us about empathy and structure and ways to coexist with people, um, with grace and with clarity, and to establish healthy relationships that are both open and have their limits. So, to everyone listening, if this conversation resonated with you, please remember to give the thumbs up and to subscribe to our channel so that you can be notified about upcoming episodes. Until next time, keep talking, keep listening, and keep growing.